Hi, Anne. How you doing?
I'm doing just great. It's great to be able to talk to you. I've been reading your blog for a long time, since right after 9/11, and when you were one of the original bloggers, and I was desperate to hear from the outside of Madison world about we could be more in touch with reality. Actually, you were one of the original guys. So
That's
it's an honor to talk to you.
That's really sweet to say. It was it was an interesting little period of media creation, to say the least, after September 11th, and a lot of people were sort of blogging and finding a way to circumvent the fact that their local op-ed page really sucked in a time of crisis.
You should have seen what it was like in Madison in those days. I mean, people went right into the kind of old peace movement talk. And the Friday after 9/11, there was a memorial service on the mall here at the university, and 20,000 people showed up, and the people at the mics were all just giving us the old ideology from the peace movement, as if they hadn't missed a step. They just suddenly got a big platform with a giant audience. It was really horrific. And
it's, it actually dovetails a little bit even to the healthcare debate. I don't know if you watched C-SPAN yesterday, like a damned junkie, but I unfortunately did for some of it.
A little on C-SPAN, a little on Fox, a little on CNN. I think C-SPAN is the best place to be, though, to avoid the horrible commentators.
Yeah, and I mean, all of it, whenever these kind of huge national kind of events or crises or political discussions takes place, I very quickly end up in a place of can we just do anything to make it stop so I don't have to watch it? I mean, it's to see the grooves that are just carved out in the pavements of where everyone stands on things, even if sometimes they're based on totally legitimate ideology, but when it's absolutely 1,000% predictable and it's based on a kind of fundamental demonization of the opponent's motives, it makes my eyes glaze over even more than the bad policy itself does on some occasions.
Yeah, especially after waiting an entire year for the vote. But they did manage to keep it in play as if the outcome wasn't known until pretty late into the day yesterday. That was a good suspense. I got to give them credit for that.
I should mea culpa all over the place and probably disqualify myself from all commentary in that as soon as Scott Brown got elected, I would tell anyone who asked, this is over. It's not happening. They're just managing the failure at this point and turning it into a PR spin. And I'm wrong.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was just flat out wrong. Self-evidently, I would have been wrong even if they would have lost last night. It's really remarkable what they pulled off.
Yeah, we never introduced ourselves, so I want to call attention to something that was in the New York Times on Sunday, but I'm going to feel slightly nervous until I say I'm Ann Althouse at the University of Wisconsin and the blog Althouse, and you're?
I'm Matt Welch. I'm the editor-in-chief of Reason Magazine, your magazine for free minds and free markets and free pop and everything else.
And you're one of the original bloggers, and I'm just wondering if you still have that hat.
You know what? I do have a version of that hat. I had given it to somebody at the 2004 Democratic Convention in Boston. It involved Southie. It was all a nightmare. But I happened to be traveling in France with my great old friend Ken Lane, who's now the editor of Wanket. And we were in a little village in a really beautiful part of France called Quercy, near the Dordogne. And he's like, "Dude, your hat, it's over there." And we looked at a little tour stand, and the exact same hat was there. So I had that.
You should have got a whole supply to last a lifetime. I assume that straw. It's straw, right? I assume that straw would deteriorate.
Really a lousy straw hat, and that picture, which is now 12 years old, was taken the day after my wedding, and my face is just swollen with drink. It's pretty good.
Now, so the article I was going to draw attention to, there was an article in the New York Times over the weekend, I'll put the link in the sidebar, about how after Scott Brown was elected, Obama and Rahm Emanuel were kind of felt that they had to scale it way back and turn it into what was referred to as a skinny bill. I guess skinny guys like to call things skinny. But then, so the skinny bill, as if it was like a skinny latte or something. But then Nancy Pelosi told them that would be kitty stuff or something like that, kitty. So I think she really was responsible for that for people keeping heart after Brown was elected, and that Obama on his own would have given it up. So maybe Obama doesn't deserve so much credit other than just doing all the hard work of giving speech after speech and doing all those telephone calls after Nancy told him he had to do it.
Yeah, that's possible. I mean, if you consider the kind of inside the Beltway discussion over the last couple of weeks, in addition to being about healthcare, has all been about Rahm Emanuel's job and whether he should keep it or not, which sounded like to me part of my narrative, which turned out to be false, that it's all over, but the blaming, that they were looking for someone to pin the blame on failing, and now that's just not the case. So maybe we should be giving credit for good and ill to the Speaker of the House, who said last night, by the way, I don't know if you saw this, and I hadn't read this in all the coverage about the healthcare reform bill, but this bill is going to create 4 million jobs. Raise your hand if you believe that.
Well, all the numbers are phony now. It's sort of, it's like 1984 or something like that as far as just the propaganda. I just think they're just making up numbers. They claim that there are jobs. That all of the numbers seem to have lost all meaning, and I sort of fear for our country when we just don't believe numbers anymore, and numbers can just be made up out of nothing.
I think that that there's something to that. People who were on the pro side of this reform package, I think, were really immune to what those of us who were against it were experiencing in terms of the president's administration, whatever, just supporters. Daily mischaracterizations of things. This is going to reduce the deficit, the CBO says. Any fair reading of what the CBO was actually having to say and to talk about and the strictures under which that they were doing their work. There's no way in hell this is going to reduce the deficit. Americans don't even believe it, and Democrats don't care. And when you sort of misrepresent yourself and the bill and everything on a daily basis, and you show that you don't care, it tends to last in people's memory. You're just shooting. You're blowing your credibility for the next go round on anything. It's a very dispiriting exercise to be looking, at your own leaders and to see that they don't really care about the truth. I mean, it is naive to think that they'll tell you the truth. On the other hand, every new administration comes in with this cleansing spirit of, finally, I'm going to be the responsible one to come clean with you. And we've seen kind of the opposite in this case, and it's actually depressing.
Well, they already softened us up with the stimulus bill. I mean, money and numbers became insane a year before they started this. So, they hit us with that first. And, of course, that was all done under the name of emergency. Then money and numbers became so meaningless that people got confused about the difference between billion and trillion.
Yeah.
And that dragged on for a year, and they made up all kinds of fake numbers about all the jobs that saved. And then they just wore us down over an entire year over health care. And by now, I think we're just like a pool of goo, really. So what's left to do? I mean, we're all defeated and lost, aren't we?
There's that's a cheery of you, Anne. There's a great moment.
It's fun to be goo.
I think it was the State of the Union address. It might have been where Obama said, a year ago I stood before you, and we were on the verge, if we hadn't passed the stimulus, of having 20% unemployment. And this is really a remarkable bit of goalpost shifting because if you recall, when they were talking about passing the stimulus in the first place, one of his chief economists, Christina Romer, who actually is a super reputable economist in the academic world, came out with a paper of, okay, this is what's going to happen if you do pass the stimulus, and here's the worst case scenario if you don't. And the worst case scenario if you don't, the cap on unemployment was something like 9% or 9 point something percent. They blew through that with the stimulus, in a matter of months. And then the next time Obama's talking about it at the State of the Union, let's just double what the worst case scenario was that we said at the time. And people just, they shrug, they blink, they move on, they react to it based on their own team membership. But I'm not giving people enough credit. I think that this is part of the reason why Obama's numbers in particular, but also numbers for Congress and just generalized government, everybody out there who claims to represent you, are just tanking because that kind of credibility sort of like disinterest in your own credibility is very corrosive on people's attitudes towards government.
You can't cheat that much with percentages. If you're talking about these popularity polls, it can only add up to 100%. So you can't fool around with a lot of numbers. Although I know Barack Obama at one point said that our insurance is going to costs are going to go down 3,000%. That's some kind of insane. I mean, it's sort of like numbers. You're not even supposed to hear them anymore. But it's really weird to be comparing the numbers to fake numbers, just imaginary numbers. How much worse it would have been if they hadn't done this. So they don't really have to do their math off of any real numbers. They make up some phony numbers, and then they can produce improvements over bad things that might have happened.
And the awful logic of government intervention in various things is that when inevitably, as will definitely happen with healthcare reform and has happened already with stimulus and other things, inevitably when things fall short, they say, well, that's because we didn't pass a good enough package. We need to fix it with the following set of reforms. And you're seeing that on the federal level, on local, state level, everywhere. And there isn't sort of people aren't thinking through that bills and laws, always have unintended consequences. Usually they disappoint you, and people don't develop or detect the pattern within all of that, which is, again, a little bit dispiriting. I want to ask you, Ann, you voted for Barack Obama, correct?
Yes.
Because
I voted against John McCain. I didn't fall for the whole hope and change, and I'm not a big liberal. I'm kind of a moderate. Although I notice that online I'm a crazy extreme right winger these days, but
sure.
I'm actually pretty moderate. But I voted against McCain. That was the problem. I had voted for Bush in the previous election. So
are you a Democrat, or are you a Republican or independent?
Well, in Wisconsin you don't actually have to say. But years ago, I've been voting since 1972, and when I originally registered to vote, which was in New Jersey many years ago, I registered as a Democrat, and I voted in New York for a while. And if registration was done there, I would have registered as a Democrat. I think in Wisconsin we don't register. I can't remember. It was so long ago. But basically, I've always registered as a Democrat if I've had to register. And I've only voted. I can count on one hand the times I voted for a Republican, including for every office. I've never voted for anything other than a Democratic senator. I've voted for Russ Feingold every time he's run for office. One time I voted for Tommy Thompson for governor, and other than that, I voted for Gerald Ford back in '76, and I voted for George Bush in '04, but not in 2000. That's about the sum total of all the Republicans I've ever voted for.
I've never voted for, as long as we're confessing, I don't think I've ever voted for a Republican on certainly not for president. In California, which is even more of a one-party state now than it was 10 years ago. I voted for Tom Campbell, I believe, for Senate against either Feinstein or Boxer, and I would tend to vote for Tom McClintock. I'm trying to remember if I ever did. And I think I actually voted for Schwarzenegger the second time around, which I now feel pretty awful about.
So are you still in California?
No, I moved to D.C. 2 years ago, and D.C. actually is a one-party state.
So I was going to ask you if you were going to vote for Mickey Kaus.
I would certainly think about it, although I disagree with Mickey, not just on immigration, but on his fear of microbes, which doesn't get nearly enough press.
His fear of what? You cut out there.
Microbes? Oh, my God.
Microbes?
Listen, this is since Mickey is Mr. Blogging Heads, let me get it out there. Mickey is one of the most scared human beings I've ever met. Opposition researchers, call me. Call me. I've got the goods. He lives in terror. So
is he like always washing his hands and stuff like that? Is he like that?
It goes beyond that, let's just say. You don't want to know about the mold in the walls. And this is true, and this is about as far as I should ever talk trash about him. He's a public figure now, so to hell with him. We were once in Eugene Volok's pool, if you want to just go ahead and sear a terrible image in your mind. And I forget what we were doing. I'm sure maybe we're playing Marco Polo. And I said, oh, Mickey, I mean, you can't go in the pool, with your contact lenses. Do you know what happened to you? Because Mickey is susceptible to fear-mongering campaigns. And he's like, No, really? You mean like a bacteria gets in my eyes? And I was like, no, dude, I'm just messing with you. Nothing bad will happen. And he couldn't deal with it. It was like a stoner who was paranoid. You can't talk him out of it. So he had to get the hell out of the pool. So that's just the scratch. Yeah, I'm scratching the surface here.
I can't picture Mickey in a bathing suit.
Mm-hmm. Imagine a Speedo with American flag stripes.
That's yeah. So it was a Speedo with American flag stripes. Okay.
That might be a lie, but the important
thing
is...
Not the California flag, because the California flag doesn't have like a bear on it. I think that would make a nice Speedo.
He had a bear in a strategic location on his Speedo.
I think that'd be amusing, yeah. As long as we're doing flags.
That's all terrible. Now, listen, your husband was at
yes.
Capitol Hill, what, yesterday or 2 days ago?
I got up Friday morning, and he was up studying the bus schedules, and the rally was going to be at noon in Washington on Saturday, and he's like, he's going to just go down and get the bus at 11 o'clock and take, like a 24-hour bus ride and sleep on the bus, and then the bus ends up 5 blocks from the Capitol, and walk over to the Capitol, do his 4 hours of tea partying, walk back to the bus station, get on another 24-hour bus ride, and do his Saturday night sleeping on the bus, and show up in the late afternoon on Sunday. So that was my weekend.
Wow.
I didn't go. Now, I couldn't have done that much bus. And we had just traveled to New York the previous weekend when there was this insane nor'easter that just was horrible. So I couldn't do the traveling, but I was also I see him as kind of we're a team, and he could go out in the world and do these things that are easier for, guys to do, I think, not to be sexist. But then I'm at home, and I can then get iPhoned photographs and blog and also be comfortable and make soup and do the housework and stuff like that. So that was our division of labor. He was basically on a bus for 48 hours and then in Washington for 4 hours at the Capitol.
Is this normal behavior for your husband to hop on a bus and go to?
It was the first time we'd been separated since we got married last August 3rd. So actually, it was a big deal. It's not like he's looking for the least excuse to run off. I mean, really, it was the only time we were separated, and he felt like he had to do it so that he wouldn't be ashamed when literally, he said this, that he wouldn't be ashamed when his grandchildren asked him, well, what did you do, basically, when our country was being destroyed? That was his perspective on it.
Now, do you think the country's being destroyed?
I'm just not that pessimistic. I feel that Americans are pragmatic, and we'll pull back from it. We'll make good out of whatever happens. We'll figure out a way. And, I think some good will need to come of it. If there's bad, we'll need to fix it. Now, I don't think you can undo entitlements once they go through, although maybe there's some question about whether they're really in yet until they're, because things don't happen chronologically until 2014 or whatever. Maybe people won't like it. But I think that we'll work with what we have and shape it and try to make it better.
I tend to...
Just like we're not going to get rid of the income tax. Or there are all kinds of things we're not going to get rid of. But right. I think that people will keep their wits about them and try to make the best of what they've got and try to make, a more perfect union. And the good is the best, the perfect is the enemy of the good, or whatever that line is. What is that famous quote?
Yes, the perfect enemy of the good. Yeah. Which is an excuse
of the good. So we've got some good. Presumably there's some good in it, or they wouldn't have done it. There's a lot of bad tendencies, and they skew one way rather than the other. But I assume that it will be worked on, and something needed to be done. I mean, what we already had was enough of a problem. So the beast lumbered into position, cranked something out. It's probably bad in all kinds of ways we don't yet understand. But I assume that we'll keep it together and work on it. That's America, isn't it? Now, I think there are people like me, my husband, who went there, who really think that it's just this grand, irrevocable step toward socialism or toward ruining the private sphere. And I understand those fears. I'm not unsympathetic to them, but I just find it hard to believe the most pessimistic things.
Yeah, I'm California by nature and choice and a bunch of other stuff. So I tend to be very optimistic. I see this as part of an ongoing process in a direction that is, from my point of view, mostly negative. We're running out of money on every level, either state and local level, much more even than the federal government. And then the federal government, bails out the states and cities whenever it can. and wherever the little crisis happens, we say, oh my God, we're cutting essential services, even though in most cases we're talking about places that have drastically increased the amount of spending on their local government services during the good times when they didn't need them. And so this is part of that process, and in that sense, it's certainly negative in my point of view. I think you're right. There are some. There has to be some good impacts of that, and I think it's worth, for those who even vociferously oppose this thing to acknowledge that. I presume that it has to allow or enable people who desperately do want to get health insurance, but for one reason or another have not been able to. It's going to help their situation. I've been in that situation, and it is really awful. Mm-hmm. And if this fixes that to some degree or to a huge degree, then that is a goal, positive goal that's been met. Similarly, if me or a friend gets cancer and would have been gone bankrupt and be kicked off of their insurance, and now wouldn't be, that's positive. That's about the only shreds of optimism in it that I see, just because every response we've had, whether it's TARP for the bailouts, whether it's stimulus, and this is a very bipartisan thing, whether it's Medicare Part D in 2003, which crazy libertarians back then were opposed to, instead of opportunistic Republicans who figure out that they only hate governments when they're not running it. All of these things step in a direction towards us having to give the government more money and the government having more control over spheres of our lives. And generally speaking, government doesn't do things very efficiently, very well. And individuals find a way when they're empowered to control their own destiny, their own money. That creates markets that produce a better job. I mean, if you think about it, everywhere else in life except for, education, healthcare, or large parts of healthcare, and a few other areas that the government is heavily involved with. Every other one, like media, for example, has been going through these wonderful kind of waves of innovation and creative destruction and all this kind of stuff.
But if you think about what really ought to be shared, as opposed to the individual paying for himself, maybe sickness is the number one, because you can't, if you're sick enough, you can't make money. How do you pay for yourself? And it's just by chance that you're not the one, you're the one or you're not the one that has cancer or whatever.
Sure.
I mean, it seems to me we accept public schools, we accept tax money paying for schools. It, to me, makes more sense to pay for people's health care than to pay for everybody's schooling.
The question,
if I had to pick between the two of what should we as a group pay for people, I would think health care, medical treatments would be not the routine ones. That's a big problem. But, the major catastrophic things, it makes more sense to pay for that than to pay for school for everyone.
I'm sensitive to that, or let's say I see that argument and understand it, and occasionally feel it myself. I think that the question is more of how do you get there. Schools is a fine example. We pay as a nation 3 times as much adjusted for inflation as we did in 1970 on schools. And, is education even a little better in the non-higher education plane? I think it's either the same or worse than it was in 1970. So something's going wrong in the execution of this. Mm-hmm. And that's what I fear about this particular healthcare plan, is that I too, heavily dislike our current system. I think it's awful on a number of ways, and I've written about that a lot. I think that what this does is it entrenches, it deepens the existing system and a lot of the existing awfulnesses of the system, especially your ability to basically kind of own your own healthcare. We're still tied with our employer. When I get fired from reason, for my next transgression, it's going to take me a hell of a lot of gymnastics to get my next healthcare plan, because this is tied with your employer.
But isn't that one of the main things that the new reform is supposed to help us with? That you won't be what do they call a job lock or whatever. You won't be stuck working someplace that isn't good for you, that isn't an efficient use of your talents.
No,
simply because you got to keep the health insurance, and it seems to me that's really important.
No,
and it has a lot to do with the free market and also with free speech and freedom in a very general way. So shouldn't you like that?
No, it reinforces the bond between yourself and your employer. It might spruce up the kind of COBRA coverage afterwards, but ultimately it's still about employers providing health care, which I think is the Faustian bargain that we made after World War II. And it's the root of a lot of things that are problematic with our healthcare system, is because we have this sort of third-party abstracted system where no one understands why or what anything costs. I think what this reform does is it puts off the eventual reform that we'll have to do, which is to break that system up, to break it so that, we're in the 21st century. No one keeps their job except for tenured professors like you. Are you tenured? Am I getting you wrong? You are tenured?
What?
Are you tenured?
Yeah, I've been tenured since 1989, so,
man.
I'm old too. That's not, so I face all of the ravages of old age, so don't be too jealous.
But enough about libertarian craziness. I want to hear the difference between what your husband saw and what people were reporting about the tenor of the protests outside of Capitol Hill, since you wrote about that on your blog. What is that?
We were old enough to remember the 60s, the Vietnam War protests, and the kind of attitudes that people took around, circa 1970, and the way protesters back in that era talked. And from his perspective, I don't know if he wants me to say this, but he said he thought people were being too nice, that people were super polite, and that, he was commenting on how there was no litter left. He got into all these conversations with people. Everybody was really, it's almost like they call it a tea party, suggests that it's like a nice social event. And what he experienced really did kind of suit that term, that people, there wasn't anger, there wasn't ugliness. And the way the press tries to portray these people as a bunch of, angry fools or scary people, but it's easy to just walk right in there and talk to a lot, more so than if you would go down to your local, bookstore or something like that. There are lots of people standing around, very easy to talk to people. Everybody was friendly. He's probably better than most people at just talking to strangers. He's from Indiana. I don't know if you know anything about Hoosiers, but
basketball.
They're really friendly.
Yeah.
Do you know any Hoosiers? But so that might be a little skewed, but basically it sounded like people were super nice and that they could have afforded to be quite a bit more angry considering the nature of the protests. So I think this attempt to portray them as just like a bunch of pitchfork-wielding, hotheads and idiots, and which is typical of the way people on the left like to portray right-wingers. It's really completely a lie, I think.
The headlines that came out of it were that Tea Party protesters shouted racial epithets at John Lewis and called Barney Frank a fag or something like that.
I don't even believe that happened.
Now,
Show
why
me
is
the
that?
video. Well, first of all, I saw a video that these. I don't know about Barney Frank, but I think that there were several black members of Congress who had to kind of walk a gauntlet past some protesters, and the protesters were initially booing at them, and then they switched to the chant "Kill the Bill." Now, and there was a claim that somebody got spit on, which I totally don't believe, because I think there were guards right there. The crowd was very near to the people. If somebody spit on one of them, where's the person who got arrested? I just don't believe it. Did someone somewhere in the crowd say something that was heard as a racial or homophobic epithet? I don't know. I really question the truth of that. But even assuming that it was true, to take all these thousands of people that went to a lot of effort, including my husband, riding on a bus for 48 hours, and portray them as just a bunch of nasty racists who are just brainless hotheads, is so unfair and so disrespectful to people. I just, I think, and another thing that I was just posting about this morning about playing the race card. I think that members of Congress should be really circumspect about playing the race card. For one thing, we're in the Obama era where supposedly we were going to be post-racial and Obama was going to bring a new attitude. It's very old-fashioned to just say, oh, this was just like back in the 60s when we were being shouted at to go to the back of the bus, et cetera, et cetera. These people are very powerful members of Congress. It's unbecoming to act like you're, some woebegone victim who everyone is besieging. You're a powerful member of Congress, and you ought to have to listen to people yell and protest and, be the rabble. And maybe somebody did shout. I don't know who did or why they did. Obviously, it's wrong. It's bad. But, you're a powerful part of the government to be trying to portray everybody as racist is a racial move that you should think very hard about doing. I don't think it's appropriate. And I question whether it even really happened. But I also think that there's a tendency by black politicians to think that they can easily win over a lot of white people who are ready to think of them as kind of victims simply because they're black. And they're very powerful people. Posing as a victim is not a pretty sight, and it's a weird use of race that I really think we should get beyond.
I am sort of conflicted on the whole thing. I agree with you that it's odd, in a place where everyone has a camera phone these days and video cameras were rolling, and there were a lot of reporters and people who were desperate to find, Tea Partiers in the middle of acting like a bunch of clowns and fools, that there hasn't been any kind of audio or video corroboration of this thing happening, on the eve of a vote where the sources themselves are people who have stake in the vote. On the other hand, I have the world of respect for John Lewis. I think he's an American hero, and if he says he was called something 15 times, my instinct is to believe him or give that some credibility. Then again, he's a politician, and all politicians lie. So it's all very confusing for me. I was at the September 12th.
Did he say that directly? Do we have a direct quote from him saying that he was called that 15 times?
I think that there was a press release sent out in his name. It was his assistant or something or congressional.
How old is he?
John Lewis, he's got to be 65, 70, 75. He was on the Edmund Pettus Bridge,
Right, but is he really only in his 60s?
70s, Are you doing 12 Angry Men on me right now? Are you going to say the glasses were on the witness's nose?
No, I just think I'd like to see him stand in front of a camera and say exactly what he's saying happened. And I want to look him in the eye and hear him say that. I don't want a press release that maybe somebody else wrote. It was very effective in shaping public opinion on the day of the vote. Before we have any chance to question it, it was just a complete internet meme. It overtook the actual protests that many good people went to a lot of trouble to do. It besmirched everybody. It was a very powerful move. And I want to question that they did that. Who did it? Does he really put his name on that? Can he really stand before the camera, look me in the eye, and say that he was called that 15 times? Where were the cameras? Everybody had a camera. Where's the video? Where's the audio?
Also, Jesse Jackson.
I want to know that. I just find it hard to believe. I don't think people act like that. I have never in my life, in any kind of a situation, heard anyone do that kind of name calling. I mean, I know there are people who have attitudes like that, but it's so obsolete to actually outwardly express them. I think people have a certain kind of racism that persists, but I think that this political use of race, as was done yesterday by the people who got that, put that report out, I just think that it's very damaging, and it would be good to get beyond race and to do things on the up and up without resorting to smearing people based on race. Now, maybe it did happen, and if it did, well, I'd like it to be proved to me. You're just going to put his name on it on a written press release. He's not saying anything. There's no video. I mean, the video that I saw was of people, a big crowd of people booing and shouting and chanting "Kill the Bill," which is disturbing. They had to walk the gauntlet. I can see they probably felt pretty bad and they should be more respected. But this idea that they deserve an extra measure of respect because of their race and that they don't get the normal criticism that should be aimed at politicians, I really object to that. There shouldn't be a special immunity. And I'm not approving of the epithets at all. I know that people would like to I'm getting a lot of attacks. People are attacking me as if I said, oh, it's just fine to call people the N-word and so on. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying that politicians need to be exposed to criticism, and to hide behind some minor thing that happened with one person who went over the line, when in fact you have thousands of people who went to a lot of effort and were behaving really extraordinarily well, who are putting themselves out there for a political purpose. For all of those people to be shunted aside because one idiot said something. And, it's also the oldest dirty trick in the book, isn't it? Oh, yeah, you can ruin every protest by sending somebody from the other side in there to say one ugly thing or to hold a bad sign.
Yeah.
You can undermine every protest if that works. Who shouted it? Who did it? Who were they? Why did they do it? So even if it were yelled, I don't know who it was yelled by. I just think it was used in a political way to undercut the hard work of a lot of sincere people who went to a lot of effort and behaved extraordinarily well.
I went to the 9/12 rally, which had 100,000 people or so, give or take, on the Capitol. And I went kind of with the specific idea of looking for racists, or at least looking for the sort of dark undercurrent that we have been warned about nonstop in the media now since at least last April. It's been the Richard Hofstadter exhumation tour about the dangerous new violence that's simmering under all these Tea Party protests, even though it never flowers into actual violence, and also sort of the racist angle underneath it. And there's 100,000 people there, probably 100,000 signs and things. And I only know, and I spent maybe 4 hours there talking to people, and I was asking them questions about, do you think the president's legitimate? Trying to flush things out. I wasn't saying it, I wasn't seeing anything, any kind of like code-worded or, traditional culture war type of things. There wasn't anything about affirmative action. There was very little, there was nothing about immigration except for some mention about tacos. Someone said, I love tacos, and I'll sign. There wasn't a lot of the kind of sub-issues that you would expect if this thing was being primarily motivated or expressing of those kinds of anxieties. And so I was put in the uncomfortable, for me, position almost of saying, look, sorry, don't see it. That's not really the message that's being out there. The message is pretty consistent of a critique of government spending and involvement and debt and all these kinds of things. That plus a whole bunch of, from my point of view, ridiculous hyperbole, some of it featuring Obama in various stages of socialism or national socialism or looking like Hitler and this kind of stuff. And I think people somehow automatically assume that if someone's carrying a poster of Obama with a Hitler mustache, which is ridiculous, and they should be, blown bubbles on their heads or something like that, they assume that that's a racist thing, even though we saw plenty of Hitler mustaches during the great Bush dictatorship as well. So it's very difficult. The
classic poster theme is to portray our leader as a Nazi.
Yeah, I mean, if it says anything else, it says that we still, as Americans, if we can agree on one thing, is that we really do hate Hitler.
We don't like Hitler. Well, Meade, my husband, again, when he was down there, he said that he saw one group of people who were doing the Obama's Hitler and impeach Obama, and most of the sort of run-of-the-mill Tea Partiers were just walking around those people and ignoring them. They weren't central. They weren't important. But, I've been living in this really left, very liberal to the point of left-wing city since the 80s, and I've just been surrounded by people who the view of people on the right is that they're toxic, that you wouldn't even want to come into contact with anyone on the right. And I think, and keeping that feeling going, I mean, I don't know how widespread it is in America, but among really liberal or lefty people, the sense is that, right-wing people are kind of toxic and poison. And the sense of that, don't even go near those people, don't go to the Tea Party, you'll get right-wing on you, is that there's racism in it. That these people, if you get right into it, you'll find it comes from racism. And, I don't know if there's any element of truth in that, but the sense, don't even go near it, you'll be associated with racism, is very powerful. I think people don't want to be considered racist, that they go out of the way to examine what they're doing and avoiding racism. But I think it really does hurt. I think that a lot more people would go to the Tea Party movement demonstrations and so on if they knew that these were just really ordinary people who there's no flavor of racism to it at all.
Well, I don't know if I'd go as far as describe anybody who shows up at a political rally to be ordinary. In this country, I've always there's always something a little bit strange about political.
Yeah, but isn't it really weird that people, seemingly ordinary people, were suddenly going out in throngs just to worry about socialism and so on? I mean,
we are in a really
strange that what really caused that to happen. that was a very unusual phenomenon. And people, it was last summer when the various members of Congress went home and they were doing these town hall meetings that they were encountering people who were really angry. How did that happen?
I think it's clear, which is that there is a tendency in American political history. It's a strong one. It's right there in your Declaration of Independence. A fondness and understanding that that which governs best governs least. There are people. There's lots of quotes to find like that. It has been expressed at various times in the Republican Party, probably a bit more than the Democratic Party, but the Democratic Party has its own version of those kinds of things, usually tilting more on social issues. Regardless, neither party has come close to paying even lip service to that for the past 10 plus years. And we're in the middle of an economic crisis, one in which government's own role in it is pretty major. And there's been a series of steps taken, each of which with a definite exception of cash for clunkers, but with no other real exception. TARP, stimulus, bailing out banks, Wall Street, the whole thing. They've been hysterically unpopular. This thing that passed yesterday is incredibly unpopular for a major overhaul happening to our system. And so when consistently the wishes of the people are being disregarded by the politicians in power and by the leaders basically of both political parties whenever they're in power, there is going to be a backlash. I trace this back. We can talk about Scott Brown. We can talk about the Didi Scazafaza. We can talk about the healthcare protests. To me, the single most remarkable indicator that we live in a new political time in terms of how pissed off people are was the California special elections of last May, when you had the entire political class, Governor Schwarzenegger, every newspaper except for the San Diego Union Tribune and the Orange County Register, the head of the Democratic wing in the Senate, state Senate, everybody said you have to pass this package of reforms, and that's the only way we can save the state from ruin. We know you don't like it. It's gonna suck. It sounds bad. We're jerry rigging everything here. But please, you have to pass this. You have to be a sober adult for a moment and agree with your wise betters. So everyone agreed that you had to do this. They outspent the no votes by an average of 7-1, and they lost by an average of 30 percentage points in a totally blue state that's never been more blue. So you had, anytime there's been a chance for citizens to have contact with their elected representatives, whether it's in a meeting or whether it's in a special election, whether it's what your husband saw this past weekend, they've been yelling at them. These policies don't work, and there is no place where that American tradition of look, it's capitalism. People fail. Let them fail. Let that investment bank fail instead of letting them write the policy under which they're regulated. That has had no expression politically, and so it is absolutely natural that in the time of 10% unemployment, you're going to see people who are pissed off and are going to express that. And I just think in the next 6 months, that's going to be the American political conversation. And a large part of it is going to be the people who are excited about what happened yesterday, pointing at the opponents and saying, well, look, they're just deranged. They are deranged racists. They are not to be taken seriously. They stand on the wrong side of progress in every case. And, thank God we have enlightened leaders to enact policies to the contrary.
Well, I was thinking that people who tend to dislike want small government and want to rely on the market, that they would tend to go back into their private life, to be cynical about the government, but just trying to make the best, cultivate your garden kind of an attitude and just try to make a good life of it for yourself, but that they wouldn't they wouldn't stay angry. They wouldn't keep going out to the demonstrations. I understand why people on the left do that because they're trying to make big things happen, but the people whose orientation is toward keeping things from changing and wanting stability and wanting to preserve tradition and those kinds of more conservative things, or stop helping me if you're the government, that the tendency of people like that wouldn't be to stay out on the street, to stay angry, but would be to pull back into the cocoon of one's own home, one's own life, and to, accept that something has happened and be finally free from having to pay attention to it. The vote is in, we're stuck with this. You just fall back into your old kind of passive cynicism, or you're focused on your life, yourself individually, not trying to do collectivist. The collectivist mentality seems to go along with going out and becoming politically active and making demands of the government. If you have the opposite orientation, I would think it'd be pretty hard to stay angry and stay out there on the street and continuing making demands. I'm surprised that people got it together at all to do demonstrations.
I think you make a pretty good point. I mean, I am not a street protester by any stretch of the imagination, and by temperament, my temperament's much closer to what you would describe. You know, I could have happily spent this weekend just watching a bunch of Alex Chilton cover songs on YouTube and kind of sinking into my own sadness about the passing of a great American. You know, and
I could have watched reruns of Davy Crockett and be mourn the passing of Fess Parker.
I went to school in Santa Barbara. Fess Parker was probably the biggest real estate owner in the area. I could tell you stories. Oh, yeah? But no, I think it's totally healthy and actually. So
did you see Fess Parker in his Speedo?
I would like to claim that I did, but you're asking me to remember my college experience, and that's not going to happen. But no, I think it's normal for Americans to seek value outside in their lives outside of politics. I think that is the healthy way to go. There just comes a point, though, where you feel like, holy crap, it's the trains run in the wrong direction, and that over there might be a cliff. It would be unpatriotic to not say anything. And I think a lot of people have got to that point. Who knows what the real motivation is or anything like that. But ultimately, I think it's pretty clear. I mean, the message has been pretty consistent from these people. It isn't about foreign policy. It's not about, keeping Terry Schiavo alive. It's not about a lot of the stuff that made Republicans, unpopular or controversial when they had power. It's about, we are ballooning the size of the debt deficit to the extent of which we haven't seen since World War II, when, if I'm pretty sure there was a war on back then. Things are kind of crazy, and elected leaders everywhere are saying, well, we just need more money. If we only could spend more money on this, then something good will happen.
So this must be really exciting for you guys and gals over at Reason, that it shows that the real political power is on the sort of libertarian side on it, and not the social conservative, aspect of conservatism that the Republicans seem to be channeling, that there's a new opportunity to do conservatism without all the social conservative baggage. Is that what you're hoping for? And that what you see an omen of that in these protests? Omen isn't right.
Definitely see a big trend in that direction. I mean, the fact that Ron Paul won the straw poll at the Conservative Political Action Conference, and even you take Ron Paul aside, there was various polls there about people's priorities, what's the biggest thing on your mind, and social conservative issues were just down in the crapper with these people. And these are that convention in particular tend towards Christian conservatism more than, let's say, economically libertarian conservative. I don't have any faith in conservatism, period, being that type of person who just doesn't place a lot of faith either in politicians. And I just personally am anti-conservative. I like progress and weird things.
Well, now, if we look at how the politics are going to play out in the aftermath of last night's vote and going forward into the elections this fall, how do you think that's going to work? Because I think one thing that really happened was that the idea of pro-life Democrats was undermined pretty seriously, and I know that people on the Republican side are going to, I think, push the idea that there's no place for pro-lifers on the Democratic side. When it really counted, they sold you out. And so it'll be real leverage for Republicans to say, pro-lifers all come over here. Now, that's a trend that is counter to the libertarian trend that you were just identifying. So there's a real opportunity for whoever's not Democrat, the Republicans, the Tea Party, the Libertarians, whatever, moving into the 2010 election and on to 2012. And yet there's that built-in conflict. It's the same old conflict. But how do you think that will play out, and how do you think the different players will leverage the opportunity?
For sure, there's going to be a hell of a lot more economic libertarianism at the center of Republican message in the 2010 elections. I remember talking to, I think it was Grover Norquist, and if I'm getting that wrong, sorry, Grover. But asking who's going to be the 2012 Republican nominee, or what's going to be the messaging of the 2010 by-elections. And it's like, look, the only message, actually it might have been somebody from Red State, but anyways, the only message is, that famous chart with all the red deficits going forward under Obama. That's it. I mean, show people the oh my God, I can't believe we're going in this direction fiscally kind of chart, and that's enough. Maybe plus unemployment, and I think that you will see that being front and center of the messaging, and certainly politicians like Chris Christie in New Jersey and other people are emphasizing that more. I think long term, as much a central part of, if not more, a central part of the Republican kind of self-identification these days is a real hawkish, real go-it-alone foreign policy. So when they're in opposition, it doesn't really matter. They don't need to talk about it. But for a lot of libertarians, that's kind of an unpalatable mix. We see this right now. There's a story in Politico talking about kind of national Republican unease with Rand Paul currently leading the primary challenge to replace Jim Bunning's Senate seat in Kentucky. He's unserious on foreign policy. He's not a big friend of Israel. He's a kook. He maybe likes drug legalization or something. So you see these little frictions coming up, and I still think it's a major part of Republican identity to be uber hawkish, and those tensions will come out when people are in a governing position. But I mean, it's true right now. The unclaimed territory in American politics is this sense of kind of fiscal conservatism or fiscal sanity. It's a reason why people like Paul Ryan are going from obscurity to a certain kind of popularity and cultish followings.
Although Paul Ryan talks about the pro-life stuff too a lot.
I don't know if that's been, maybe, my ears are not attuned to abortion arguments in general, just because it's never been an issue that I care to even discuss, let alone have involved in politics. I think for sure you are going to have social conservatives as part of the Republican big tent. And what's really super awkward for me as someone who doesn't like social conservatism is that we've seen a lot of the most fiscally conservative Republicans out there being the most socially conservative too, and it's exactly the ones who are most socially tolerant, people like Schwarzenegger, who end up being big squishes on fiscal responsibility. But I mean, ultimately, I think that's the reason why Republican politics is never going to attract me personally, or some people from this broad camp. What's really interesting is that in this really dynamic, fluid moment where there's a big sort of anti-government feeling out there, the Republicans aren't much more popular than they were beforehand. This says to me that all of this energy is going into kind of an unclaimed or independent direction, even if it is unquestionably, I think, right of center in terms of its locus.
That's why I think the Democrats are going to recover now that they've got their vote in, and they can start muting this healthcare dispute, and they can start being sort of normalizing, and I think we'll kind of move back, people in general will move back into a kind of an equilibrium where they like the Democrats about as much as they used to, and I don't see how the Republicans are really going to move into any space that was created, even as that space will close up. So, you can't. There was an opportunity that was created, but I don't really have that much faith that the Republicans are going to. I mean, you have to have an actual candidate that people want to vote for, and I think. We've been paying attention to health care for a year. I think now people are going to want a break. We'll calm down. Summer will take place. By fall, it'll be almost a blank slate, and the Democrats will be able to get their old constituents back there voting for them. Is that too pessimistic, or?
I don't know if it's pessimistic or optimistic, but I think that I disagree with the assessment. I think that we're on a great kind of pendulum situation, and the pendulum increases in velocity. Like in 2006, independents just jumped off the Republican bus and went heavy for Democrats in the by-elections. And they also were heavily enthusiastic about Obama in 2008. To see how fast and how far independents have turned against Obama and the White House and the Democratic Party in general since then is astonishing. And you will see those people strategically vote for Republicans, even if they don't consider themselves Republican, just because they want to punish somebody. So I think the anti-incumbency thing goes in both directions, and both parties tend to misinterpret what it means. I think Democrats miscalculated pretty gravely after they were able to drive Bush and everybody else out of the temple in 2008. They took that as a mandate for kind of 1970s era Democratic Party economics. I don't think there was a clear mandate for that at all.
Yeah, I don't either. And, I mean, as I was saying, I voted for Obama, and I didn't really think he would behave the way he did. I mean, a lot of my readers are telling me I was a fool, but I didn't think that's what he was saying. I think when he spoke about health care, he was being more pragmatic and limited than Hillary Clinton was. That was one reason he got ahead of her, was that he seemed more reasonable and sensible and less ideological. I saw him as a thoughtful, careful person who would be a good figurehead and not be too extreme.
Yeah, as I think Megan McArdle wrote just before the election, Obama and his economic people, they seem to have a certain gravitas about what they're doing. They seem to be particularly attuned to making sure that their numbers add up. And I remember thinking and writing as soon as he won the election, there is my one glimmer of hope for the guy. Because on his good days, you think, my God, I'm glad he's the president instead of the other guy or any other guy, because he's very smart guy, has a pretty strong command when he's in his element of details and big picture. And he can be a very, very impressive person. So if you match that with someone who actually cares about the numbers adding up and doing things like promising a net spending cut, which he did late in the campaign, you think, okay, maybe this is going to turn out well, and that just went pear-shaped immediately. Yeah. It turns out that the promises were hollow, the politics were hollow, and especially this sort of commitment to numerical veracity has turned out to be a total kind of sham, and that is sort of the biggest disappointment. Because economics matter, especially though not only from my point of view, they do, and I think that they're going sort of hysterically in the wrong direction on economic policy. And until that reverses somewhat, I don't have a strong faith that we'll see, more American-style growth and unemployment for a long time now. And that's filling me with some amount of un-Californian dread. And that's a real pessimistic note to end on. We've got 1 minute left. What makes you optimistic for the next 6 months? Let's talk happily.
Well, I think we can finally get a little air into the debate. We can stop talking about passing the health care bill and maybe pay some attention to some other issues, or maybe stop paying attention to the government. But I guess that's what they want. So I don't know that that's an optimistic thought. That's just what I think people will do, that people have had enough and that we're tired of looking at them. I'm tired of looking at them. I'm tired of talking about insurance. But it's surprising that none of the other issues have really taken precedence during this whole period. None of the foreign policy issues, none of the issues about terrorism have really come to the fore. I don't know why. Maybe we should be happy that we're in times of relative peace and, if not prosperity, at least a lack of horrible violence.
I mean, unfortunately, I think part of the reason why we have that sense is that the air went out of the room on anti-war sentiments. And so the same people who were talking constantly about Afghanistan 18 months ago are much more muted now, even though we've doubled the size of troop levels there and violence is way up and skirmishes in Pakistan are way up and these kinds of things. Again, not to be a big downer. My point of optimism in all of this nonsense is that you can only push through policies that are strongly against a majority of people for so long. And it's not just healthcare, it's everything. It's basically the whole bailout economics package since September 2008. I think politics and governance is the last area in which kind of the technological and business revolutions that have that have greatly enhanced our lives and made our conversation right now possible. I mean, why do you and I even know each other? It's because of these kind of technological advances that have revolutionized things. It'll happen to politics last, but when it does, it'll be because people feel so totally alienated and pissed off about what people are doing with their money. And that is happening now. So I hope that that is channeled in some kind of positive direction to kind of break up the guaranteed revenue streams and all the sort of sclerotic ways in which politics has control over our lives.
Can I say one more thing about the war? And that is one reason why I am kind of still glad I voted for Obama is I think it's been a good thing that the Democrats have had to take ownership of the wars and of the fight against terrorism and have it not just be something associated with Bush or with the Republicans, that most of the things Bush was doing needed to be done. And now that Obama is doing them too, the fight is, it's kind of receded. So we're not fighting over things that we used to fight for because the Democrats have taken ownership of it. I think that's been a healthy thing.
Yeah, I would think it's more healthy if I agreed more with the policy. I tend not to think that we should have 180,000 U.S. troops permanently stationed all over the goddamn place. And so that kind of bipartisan, whoever's in a responsible position is now acting responsibly and not fighting against it, I think doesn't solve what is my kind of foreign policy existential crisis, which is that as long as we are the world's super cop and expanding that role, then the sense of responsibility that the rest of the world takes for itself will continue to be low, and the target on our back will continue to be larger. And so that crisis doesn't end with a changing of teams in Washington. Although you're right, the bitter and distracting and hypocritical debate tends to recede during those times. But speaking of recession, let's get the hell out of here.
We hit an hour.
Past an hour. We've got an hour. Very nice talking to you, Anna.
It's great talking to you.
And let's do this again.
Okay, yeah, that'd be great. Bye-bye.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye-bye.